I do think we have to define like what is hybrid training.
I had to really learn how to combine strength and endurance in a way that's going to minimize that interference, maximize recovery, and allow you to be good at a ton of different things.
But once you go over a threshold, you're no longer training your aerobic capacity anymore. You're kind of training a different system. Is that how that works?
Pushing a little bit harder on zone 2 work is going to give you more adaptation. What you have to account for is it's also going to be harder to recover from. So if your goals are to have modest cardio fitness, sure, do some higher rep sets, do some circuit style training, do some kettlebell complexes, etc. Your cardio is going to be fine. But the question is it cardio in the same sense that cardio is cardio? You can get so much more aerobic benefit from true cardio training. And that's what it's going to take if you want to take your cardio beyond a certain level. And that really just comes down to what your goals are.
And so Alec, I was looking up some stuff, and talk to me about the quote unquote world record for Murph. I just want to start there because I think that a lot of our listeners are familiar with what Murph is, which is, obviously you're hitting runs, you're hitting body weight. Did you do it with a vest? Did you separate it out? Like, how do you set the quote unquote world record for Murph? Talk to me about that, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure your CrossFit audience will be interested in this. So I have, I guess, the unofficial record, like it's not a Guinness record or anything, right? But fastest known time for the weighted and unpartitioned format. So with a 20-pound vest and not breaking up the reps at all. So it's the mile run right into the 100 pull-ups, get all the pull-ups done before all 200 push-ups, then all 300 squats in that second mile run. I first found out about the kind of record category or like fastest known time for it when an old buddy of mine, Hunter McIntyre, set it in like 2020, I think it was. And I saw he did a big video on it, did it for charity, and he did it in like 34 minutes, weighted and unpartitioned. And so I came across that video the next year on Memorial Day. I'm like, okay, I've raced with Hunter before. I've been close enough to him in times. I'm just going to kind of copy his strategy and like, see how fast I can do it. But I had no intentions of setting the record. And so on Memorial Day, I think 2021, it was just at my gym, with the crew, did it and ended up coming in underneath his record time and was like, wow, I had no idea that I'd be able to do that. But it wasn't recorded. It wasn't legit. So I called up a friend of mine who has like a media outlet, YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff for fitness. And I'm like, hey, I want to organize an official, unofficial record attempt. So we did a live stream. I got some judges, got the video and everything, and then did it again a couple weeks later and did it in 32:41.
32?
So it took about, yeah.
Fuck. Dude, that's so fast. For anybody listening, I mean, who have not done Murph, most people break up Murph in a variety of ways. One way is like they segment into 10 rounds of like of 10, 20, 30, right? Another way is they can break up into 5 rounds, but going straight through is so difficult, especially with the vest on, because you just get burned out, man. So that's an incredible time. What were your miles? Like sub 6s?
First one was a little bit under 6. And then the last one, I was pretty deep in the pain cave coming off the squats. I think it was closer to 7. Wow. But what I learned watching Hunter's video, I learned a lot just kind of watching what he did. I think that he ran too hard because I just saw the fatigue like immediately, going into those pull-ups. I saw him really start to fizzle out. And I know the capacity that he has. He's an insane runner. And I was like, if running a 5:30 kind of gassed him out, I probably shouldn't do it either kind of thing. So I went a little bit slower. I actually ran slower than Hunter. And I think that gave me just a lot more energy to push the reps a little bit faster. I ripped the squats super fast and, my legs, I had a hard time getting my legs back underneath me for that second run, but I think it was worth it, to be able to get through those reps so much faster. I fell apart a little bit at the end, but overall it came out okay.
Man, pacing's everything. Well, Alec, man, I'm super excited to talk to you. Usually Jason picks a lot of the guests for the show, but I was like, dude, we have to have Alec on. I stumbled on your page, man, because I've gotten super into running and this whole like hybrid athlete world. And you're obviously very big in that world. And that's a lot of what I want to talk to you about. I come from this background, which I kick myself in the butt all the time now I was a collegiate swimmer. I did triathlons afterwards, but like I was always told that like, hey, if you want to be really good at the endurance stuff, just can't lift weights. Like that's going to be counterintuitive to everything you're doing. It's not going to help. And then when I found CrossFit and found that stuff, then it was the opposite. It was, you really can't run or do the endurance stuff anymore if you want to get strong. And being, coming from an endurance background, strength was always my weakness. It was like the one thing I had to get better. And so I bought that, hook, line, and sinker. And it was a bummer for a while because I kind of like left the original sport that I really loved, which was endurance stuff. But recently with like, and that's kind of the first thing I want to talk to you about, like the resurgence and why, hybrid training has gained so much momentum, why so many people are looking to do this type of training. But that really kind of like opened my eyes to the fact that, hey, there is a way to do both. There are, maybe not direct benefits of doing one for the other, but there's definitely a bunch of indirect benefits to it. And there's a way where you can have both. So that's why I was really excited to talk to you. First question I kind of wanted to open up with is, you've been doing this stuff for a while. So maybe you can give us a quick background of just how you got into like endurance running first, and then how that turned into getting super into lifting, and then how that turned into doing both. And then I'd love to hear kind of your opinion on why you think that this is seen such a momentum shift now specifically, and why so many people are gravitating towards, hybrid training. And then we can even discuss maybe what that even means.
Yeah. So to get a little bit more into my background, in like high school and college and that kind of thing, I did a variety of sports. I would say I had a kind of natural talent for a lot of them, but was not amazing at any individual sport. I did track and field, I did cross country, I did tennis, I did baseball, and I was pretty good at most of those things. But again, I was not like a standout or all-star at any of those things. But I just kind of loved doing it all. I even did football, which is probably one of my worst sports, but I liked lifting weights with the team and, do a little bit of everything. Didn't want to give any of it up. And I kind of stumbled upon, during an off season, something called Spartan Race, which is obstacle course racing. Just signed up. It looked like a fun thing to do. And suddenly all of the skills that I'd been developing across a wide range of sports, from, running to weightlifting with a football team to wrestling, it all kind of came together in that first obstacle course race, and I crushed it and had more fun than I've ever had in my life doing anything. I was like, this is awesome. So I signed up, did more of those, kept kind of making the podium, performing really well. And eventually Spartan Race signed me to their pro team. So I got to travel around the country and do dozens. I think I did like 100 of those races. I stopped keeping track, but did a lot of Spartan races. So that's kind of how I got into the hybrid niche. And when I started doing those competitively, I started thinking less about, training for cross country or training for wrestling. And I started thinking about, okay, how can I take strength training and endurance training and mobility training and athletic training? How can I combine all of these things together to be really good at the sport of OCR? And this was, almost probably 10 years ago. So that's how I really got into it. And from there, my niche kind of grew. I started coaching a lot of like military athletes and people like that, and just getting exposed to a lot of different types of hybrid training. It's a very broad thing, right? There's no precise definition of what hybrid training is. So I started talking with people who wanted to, do a powerlifting competition and train for a 50-mile ultra and all this stuff. So I had to really learn how to combine strength and endurance in a way that's going to minimize that interference, maximize recovery, and allow you to be good at a ton of different things, and in a way that not a lot of people had been doing. But I've seen it definitely gain popularity, I think in large part just because of a lot of CrossFitters and obstacle course athletes and high rocks athletes who are pushing the limits in ways that are pretty new, and just getting people really excited about it. And I think in the social media age, it's just easier to share some of those cool niches that probably, flew under the radar before. But now just being able to put yourself out there more and be like, hey, look at this crazy event called High Rocks or Spartan or whatever. It's just easier for those kinds of cool, like niche athletic pursuits to gain some traction. And I'm really excited about it. I love to see it.
Hey, Alec, I just have a quick question just to go back. I heard you talk about this on another podcast, but just to clarify, when you go quote unquote pro in Spartan races, like what does that entail? Like, do they sign you to like a contract? You have to wear certain things? Like, do you get paid by them? Like, were you getting paid at a young age to do these Spartan races? I was just curious.
Yeah, so there's been different levels, and the contracts have evolved over the years. In the early days, like the first pro teams, it was sponsorship based, so getting paid by sponsors to wear certain clothes, etc., and then getting paid by the company to travel around and represent them at all of the races. So as far as revenue, it was more prize money for winning events, and then contracts with sponsors and that sort of thing. I think later, beyond my time when I was no longer on the team, I think Spartan was paying their athletes directly, but I don't know. It's varied a lot from year to year and athlete to athlete.
How old were you when you did that? Did the travel and signed on?
So I was on their pro team from like age 18 to age 20, and I'm 30 now.
Did you go to college after high school, or did you jump straight into this stuff?
I did. I went to Georgia Tech to pursue physics, and because of how much I was into Spartan, I had to decide. That was kind of the tough part of like, do I want to pursue individual athletics and like some of the hybrid stuff, do CrossFit and Spartan and those sorts of things, or do I want to try to run cross country? And pole vault I was a pole vaulter. Do I want to try to pole vault for college? So that was a tough decision, but ultimately I decided to pursue things on my own, which who knows how things would have turned out if I had, chosen differently. No regrets, but yeah, it was a tough choice.
Unconventional choice, right?
Yeah,
for sure. I just had a quick question back on the Spartan race, just because I'm curious. My understanding, because I did a Tough Mudder, and I believe I did like a low key Spartan race, not one of the crazy ones. I'm curious though, wasn't there a time where like instead of climbing the rope, you could do like burpees, or instead of doing some obstacles, you could do a substitute? Was that still a thing even at the pro level, or did that go away?
Yeah. So basically how the sport has evolved is there used to be a penalty for obstacles where you had to at least give what the judges would call an honest attempt at an obstacle. And then if you failed it, the penalty was to do 30 burpees. And in most cases, 30 burpees, especially when it's not just like do 30 burpees in the gym, right? It's like go stand in that mud pit and do 30 burpees. Like it's kind of a shitty penalty. Like it's not fun to have to go through that. So it's in your best interest to give an honest attempt and complete the obstacle. It can save you, probably a minute and a half to 2 minutes of fatigue as well. They started having difficulty with enforcing the penalty for large groups of people. So I think in recent years, they've adopted some like penalty loops and some other penalty structures. Pros and cons to that. I kind of like the old school burpee penalty. It really sucked. I think it was a bigger incentive for obstacle completion. At the pro level, to be eligible for cash prizes, there was a series of obstacles that were mandatory completion. So there were certain ones that you can't burpee out of or you'd be disqualified. I don't know if that's still the case. I don't think it is. That's another thing I kind of miss from the old days with some of the mandatory obstacle completion. Sandbag carry. There was one called the Tyrolean Traverse, where you kind of have to, crawl underneath a rope horizontally. Some of the obstacles like that, it's like you either complete it or you're DQ'd. And there were a lot of great athletes who would, they could run a 15-minute 5K, they'd get to that obstacle, fail, and they're out. So that was really cool in some of the early days of you have to be strong, you have to be proficient at everything, or you're just not going to complete it.
Dude, super. Do you think that the sport has lost a little, has fizzled out a little bit? I feel like I don't hear about Spartan races as much now, with High Rocks kind of like getting a lot of popularity. Or is it still something that's big, but just, it's not our world?
I don't think it's as popular as it used to be with High Rocks coming to the scene. I also think that, Spartan and Tough Mudder, they used to be one of several, major event companies, and a lot of them went bankrupt. They just weren't able to maintain profitability. I know those obstacle builds and stuff, it's a very costly operation. And so a lot of the companies that used to be popular with some of the high level guys, they're just not there anymore. So I think Spartan now owns Tough Mudder, actually. So it's kind of like Spartan is the only one left that was able to maintain profitability from the big companies, at least. There's still some like mom and pop ones. And they've, I think, also to help maintain profitability, they've kind of broadened their scope into other events. Like they just host peer trail runs now. They have their indoor like Deca Fit, Deca Strong series, which is kind of like High Rocks. So I think they're kind of, I don't use the word watered down, but they're kind of spreading themselves a little bit thinner as well. just because I think the obstacle scene is, one, not quite as popular as it was when it first came out, and two, it's just very, very expensive. I don't think the margins are very good on it.
Alec, go ahead, Gabe.
I was going to say, Alec, how familiar are you with the CrossFit training methodology? I know you've obviously dabbled in that world. I know you trained CrossFit for a while, but how familiar would you say you're with the training methodology?
Very familiar. I used to coach CrossFit, actually. It's not my main thing. I'm still a shitty Olympic weightlifter.
How tall are you, Alec?
5'6" in the morning.
Yeah. 5'6", and then shrink down to 5'5" by the end of the day. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5'5" after a couple heavy squats.
Yeah. So there you
go. I'm curious, how, in your opinion, does hybrid training, so trying to, and I've heard you on podcasts describe as like, trying to get the most of conditioning training and the most of strength training kind of separately to maximize those areas. How does that differentiate from how CrossFit approaches it, which is, variance and, having the workout where you're doing the 800-meter runs, sure, with the deadlift mixed in 5 rounds of that, obviously. And, a lot of people that are, been doing CrossFit for a while, they'll bring up that, main site, the most programmed workout is the 5K run. So they do the pure conditioning, but a lot of what CrossFit's become in its adaptation is like the 12 to 15 Metcon mixing modalities. So what do you think is different about those two? And what do you like more about, the dedicated strength and conditioning versus like mixing everything as CrossFit teaches it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there's a lot of variety in how CrossFit gets implemented and how people train for it at varying levels. There's definitely people who kind of go in, they do 1 or 2 main lifts, they do a Metcon that might take them 5 minutes, and that's it. I also think at a higher level, you have people who are doing more, monostructural work for aerobic development. They're taking more of a hybrid approach to CrossFit. I think when people are training more and kind of taking it more seriously, if you will. So I think there is a lot of overlap, especially. I think that kind of your casual or recreational CrossFitter probably just doesn't have the time to be able to take that sort of hybrid training approach to it, and it's just very Metcon heavy. But I would say that CrossFit has so much more just skill component, and kind of teaching to the test of you're trying to perform at these specific Metcons. So we're going to include a lot of that in the programming. Whereas how I see what people call hybrid training, I see it more as just training the fundamental fitness qualities more. So more just develop the aerobic system, improve lean body mass, build strength, and it's less about putting it into practice into a Metcon. Obviously, getting into high rocks and stuff like that, I think now we're starting to see more kind of Metcon multimodal stuff be incorporated into the hybrid side of things. But I also think we're seeing high-level CrossFitters take more of that hybrid training approach too. So I think we're starting to see them, more overlap than there used to be. But the key difference I would say is just there's a much bigger kind of skill and specificity component to the CrossFit side of things.
For the average person that is literally just trying to like look better, improve health, gain some lean body mass, like, do you think they're leaving something on the table by being super Metcon heavy and not having the pure aerobic days and the pure strength days and kind of more of that approach? And then we can talk about people with like specific goals, like, putting on muscle, getting as strong as possible.
I do. I think that Metcons, if you're, a relative novice, I think they can be fairly stimulating across a wide range of, fundamental fitness attributes. You could do a traditional kind of CrossFit approach, Metcon heavy, and that's going to improve your cardio substantially. You're going to gain a lot of muscle, etc. But I think as you kind of your training age increases, you get a little bit more experience. It's going to take a little bit more of a targeted approach for each fitness attribute. You're going to have to become a little bit more specific with how you improve your aerobic conditioning. You're going to have to be a little bit more specific with how you improve certain skills and add muscle mass to certain muscle groups and that sort of thing. So I think if you try to get extremely fit and take pure Metcon work too far, it starts to not really be worth the squeeze in terms of just being very fatiguing and very costly for the fitness benefit you get. Not to say that there's not value to it or you shouldn't be doing it from a skill perspective, competition perspective, performance, all that kind of stuff. But if you just want to, improve your aerobic capacity, there's very simple ways to do that. I think you're going to get more bang for your buck in terms of overall aerobic capacity with a simple monostructural 30-minute bike ride than you will from virtually any Metcon, especially when you account for the recovery cost of that.
Yeah, recovery costs a big deal. I give Jason a hard time all the time because he's not a big zone 2 guy, not a big go easy guy. Like he'll go in and like left to his devices, he's training 10 to 15 minute Metcons every single day and just loves lighting his hair on fire. But
look at the results though, Gabe. And I think that this is something we need to approach with like interest, right? Like so high rocks, hybrid training, it's definitely on like a rise. I get it, right? Separating out your strength, your conditioning. Cause like I do think we have to define like what is hybrid training, or at least like hone in on it. And you kind of alluded to it, Alec, by saying like, hey, someone who wants to get ready for a powerlifting competition and also run a half marathon, for example. Okay, I can start wrapping my head around those two people, or the person who wants both. But like, I think what CrossFit did for the industry, I personally think it revolutionized the idea of effort and intensity. And I think that that's carrying over into these hybrid training modalities. Like, meaning like if all you do is went into the gym and, did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, did a little bit of running, a little bit of this, I don't think you'd ever get close to the capacity built by these CrossFit athletes and I think that mindset, I believe, has now evolved because of, to your point, Alec, like the training age, because I've kind of seen that in myself, but it still takes like this effort. You guys get what I'm saying? Like, I think what CrossFit did more than anything is they added a clock and an effort to all these things. And then when you talk about Metcons, I think the skill component, I think, could be separate. I think that's more sport specific. But I think what it did is it started alluding to, hey, if you bust your ass, you create adaptation. So that's kind of what I think CrossFit has really done for the industry really well. And I think it's carried over into hybrid training.
Yeah. And to your point too, I think that a lot of people who are really intense about CrossFit and get really good at it, I know CrossFitters who are training, several hours a day, and they might do multiple Metcons and that kind of stuff. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to work out 3 days a week for 60 to 90 minutes, and I want to maximize muscle mass, aerobic fitness, all those sorts of things. And I'm like, all right, maybe we should get a little bit of like pure cardio work, like give me a couple 800-meter intervals or something like that. I think that works really well for someone who maybe they don't have all the time in the world. Whereas if you're training like, 2-3 hours a day and you're able to handle that, eating enough food and et cetera, you're going to get a ton of results just from the collective effort of all of that training. Whereas for the general population person who's doing a little bit less and they're like, I have 2-3 hours a week and I want to be able to run a 10K. It's like, all right, let's get a little pure cardio in there. Whereas for someone like you, Jason, I could see why you're like, nah, I probably don't need to do a lot of straight cardio work just because you have all of that training volume, all of that effort, accumulating throughout the week.
Yeah, no need to run ever again after I just did my high rocks with Gabe.
I think that, one thing that I know we all agree on, and Jay, I agree that CrossFit really revolutionized this, is the fact that like effort and like training hard is at the crux of like getting results. And I think what CrossFit changed was a lot of people before were maybe doing strength and conditioning, and that looked like, some easy work on the elliptical or the Stairmaster followed by some easy work on some cable machines, relatively easy. I mean, and if the intensity is never there, then you're kind of spinning your wheels regardless. I think that.
I'm a simp for effort. Like, and I should also add, like, I'm not as big of a fan of zone 2 as some people might assume. Like, I think for a lot of people, like if you're a professional endurance athlete or high level endurance athlete training 20 hours a week, you have to do like zone 1, 2, like easy work, just because the volume is so high, you can't sustain a higher effort. Like to get in that level of volume, a lot of it has to be easy. But if I was training a CrossFitter and I wanted to work on their aerobic capacity and get them a little bit more aerobic volume, I'm probably going to push them a little bit harder than that. I'm not going to say just like go sit at 60% heart rate on the bike, especially if they don't have a ton of time to work with, and be like, let's try to squeeze a little bit more out. Let's give a little bit more effort than that. You know what I mean?
Are you still getting benefits to your aerobic capacity if you're going out? Because one thing that I've heard is, and I'm sure this is an oversimplified explanation of it, that like, once you are over zone 2, and we can go into like, whether, a heart rate is accurate or kind of what that looks like. But once you go over a threshold, you're no longer training your aerobic capacity anymore. You're kind of training a different system. Is that how that works? Or is that just like an oversimplified way of looking at it?
I think it's an oversimplified way of looking at it. It's not really a switch that goes on and off. You're not turning off your aerobic system or anything like that. You're just limiting the amount of volume that you're going to be able to accumulate. And from a low intensity kind of aerobic adaptation perspective, when we look at improving cardiac output, when we look at improving mitochondrial volume and density, the correlation between those outcomes and just total training volume is extremely strong in terms of total aerobic training volume. The relationship with intensity is almost not, I don't want to say non-existent, but it's pretty weak. Whereas we've seen in terms of workload compared to lactate threshold, you can train at 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%. Anywhere from about 50 to 90% of lactate threshold when volume equated is going to drive virtually the same adaptation in terms of some of those adaptations commonly associated with low intensity work, the cardiac output improvements over time, the mitochondrial volume and density. There are adaptations specific to intensity that you have to work beyond lactate threshold for, you have to work harder for. But there's not like it's not like, oh, your heart rate went 2 beats too high, your aerobic adaptations are dead. It's like, no, you're starting to bring in a little bit more, anaerobic activity. Your recovery might be compromised a little bit. You're not going to be able to go as long and accumulate as much volume, but the underlying adaptations are still happening. It's just kind of a cost benefit analysis with the recovery. All else being equal, pushing a little bit harder on zone 2 work is going to give you more adaptation. What you have to account for is it's also going to be harder to recover from. So what's the cost of that? But again, if you're not trying to accumulate 20 hours a week, you probably don't have to slow down and be as conservative as someone who's only training for 2 or 3 hours a week. I don't think that person has to be as concerned about, oh no, I went to 80% instead of 75%. I think they're going to be just fine and probably actually benefit a little bit more, assuming recovery is in place. My kind of gold standard is always evaluate recovery and evaluate performance at your high intensity sessions. If you notice that as you start to push your easy work a little bit harder, you notice that your recovery is going downhill and your high intensity performance is going downhill, you should probably back off a little bit. But if you're feeling good and high intensity performance is preserved and you want to try to increase your zone 2 work from 70%, 75%, give it a whirl and see how it goes. And like the only way to really understand and get that intensity dialed in perfectly for you is kind of that fuck around and find out mentality of see what intensity is going to be sustainable and recoverable for you. And it can vary a lot depending on a ton of individual factors, from training volume to fitness level and absolute level of output, all those sorts of things. There's no one way to say this is the right intensity for you.
When you're working with and prescribing clients there, how are you prescribing the effort you're trying to see on any given day? Are you using RPE? Are you using heart rate? Like what does that look like?
Sometimes it depends on the person and the strategy that we're implementing. Polarized training is kind of all the rage these days, which is a lot of like low intensity zone 2 work. And then when it's time to go hard, you go really hard. So it's either like, it's a combination of a little bit of really hard training with a lot of low intensity base work.
Do you call that polarized training?
Polarized training, yeah. That's kind of the most popular kind of endurance training model or approach these days. Is, you might have heard of like the 80-20 approach, like 80% of your work should be very easy, 20% of your work should be really hard. That's kind of the polarized training model. But there's other approaches. There's also what we call sweet spot training. There's what we call pyramidal training. There's other styles of training that will use a little bit more moderate intensity work, for example. So there's no one size fits all approach to even distribution of low, medium, and high intensity work. That can vary too. And I find for a lot of people who are training a little bit less than your average endurance pro, some of those other models like sweet spot and pyramidal, where they're getting a little bit more moderate intensity work, can also work really, really well. Generally, from a prescription perspective, when I'm programming high intensity work, I almost always default to RPE. So if someone's running 800 meter repeats or 1,000 meter repeats, 400s, whatever, I'm just going to tell them I want that an 8 out of 10 effort or 9 out of 10 effort or something like that. Or I'll describe in slightly longer form, like, this is what I want the effort to feel like. I want you to be able to maintain a consistent pace across all 8 reps, but be, pretty gassed by the end of it, et cetera. Like, I may describe it a little bit more, but it's very RPE driven. If someone is training for an event and we know kind of race paces, I may also prescribe based off of race pace. So like, I want 10 by 800 at 5K race pace, adjust up or down from there to reach RPE 8 by the end of the workout. So that might be how I prescribe a high intensity session. For low intensity sessions, it can vary a little bit more depending on the athlete and kind of their psychology. But I'm more likely to use a combination of RPE with like a heart rate cap. So I'll say easy, like just go easy, whatever that means for you. But I don't want to see your heart rate go over 150 on this session, for example. And that cap could vary, situation to situation. And we can get that dialed in over time. And I may modify that cap based on how they respond to the training. So maybe I say, easy, whatever that means for you today, but absolute cap of 150. And if I notice that they're consistently hitting that cap, they're hitting 150, and I notice their high intensity sessions are declining, they're not recovering very well, I may say, hey, I think we need to pull back your low intensity cap to 145 and see how that goes for a little while. So that can, ebb and flow over time, depending on training volume, what we're doing in the high intensity side, that kind of thing. But that's generally how I use like RPE, pace, and heart rate kind of prescriptively across a range of different workout types.
Can you work on your cardio with 20 rep squat sets?
So this brings up an interesting study. I always bring this study up because I think it just illustrates the point really well. They've done a number of studies in like kettlebell snatches for cardio, which I think is valid because of any sort of like weightlifting or strength modality. Like lightweight kettlebell snatches for reps are probably going to be pretty decent when it comes to developing the aerobic system compared to a lot of other options. So in this particular study, they compared 12 minutes of 12-minute AMRAP kettlebell snatches with 16 kilos. So pretty lightweight. And participants, I think the group was on average getting like 250 reps. So they're doing a lot of kettlebell snatches, 12 minutes. It's 10 out of 10 effort, as many as they can possibly get. And they measured VO2, so oxygen consumption. And they compared that to VO2 max to get an idea of, what percentage output are they working at in terms of aerobic demand and heart rate demand and all that kind of stuff. And they found that while the effort was 10 out of 10 and their heart rate got to like 95% of maximum, their VO2 as a percentage of max, so their actual aerobic demand was down at like 70% of max. And 70% VO2 max is generally what we'd consider like zone 2 to 3, like easy to moderate effort. So despite the workload being all out, they're busting their ass, faces red, 10 out of 10 effort, super high heart rate, actual oxygen consumption was on par with like an easy to moderate jog. If you're someone who's not going to do a lot of cardio, if you're like, I just want to accumulate an hour per week of zone 2 to 3 cardio, whatever, you could definitely use something like that to reach that target. Like I can totally see how you could use some lightweight metcons and circuits and that kind of thing to accumulate, an hour or so per week of that level, 70% VO2 max aerobic stimulus. But what if you're someone who wants your cardio to be a little bit better than that and you need 10 hours a week of aerobic development? Like I personally do about 10 hours a week of cardio. If I tried to do 10 cumulative hours of, kettlebell snatch AMRAP, I would be absolutely fucked. Like you're going to be so destroyed from something like that. So I think the question, is it cardio or is it not cardio, is the wrong question. It's like, how much cardio benefit can we get from it? And what's the practicality of that in the context of the person we're working with and what their goals are? So if your goals are to have modest cardio fitness, sure, do some higher rep sets, do some circuit style training, do, some kettlebell complexes, etc. Your cardio is going to be fine. Like you can definitely get an aerobic adaptation from that. But the question is it cardio in the same sense that cardio is cardio? And when you ask that question, I don't think there's really a comparison to be made. You can get so much more aerobic benefit from true cardio training. And that's what it's going to take if you want to take your cardio beyond a certain level. And that really just comes down to what your goals are.
Why do you think so many people on the internet got their axles all spun up about that one study with the squats and that being cardio? It's always interesting to see, especially since I've kind of dived into this world and you start following a lot of these people, and there's like, the evidence-based crowd, and then there's like the, whatever you want to call the other crowd. It's always interesting when things get picked up and all of a sudden become this like, dogmatic fight of like who's right and who's wrong.
Well, I think it's interesting that the evidence-based crowd, because they love to share their research and interpretations of said research, but I think there's definitely a bias in terms of what topics we tend to be more meticulous about and care more about. I think a lot of evidence-based people, if they find a video of someone on the internet, in a supermarket saying something about an ingredient or a chemical that's not entirely accurate, not entirely evidence-based, they come at them with like a drone strike. Like they're taking these people out left and right. Like, you don't line up with the evidence in terms of food safety. Like, I'm coming after your ass. But then they'll post a study that's like, yeah, that was probably a pretty shitty interpretation of the evidence in terms of, aerobic fitness. And they'll just like reshare it. It's not even their area of expertise. They're just like, this confirms my biases that like, you don't need to do cardio. I'm sharing this shit all over. And it's like, you're doing the same thing that you come after other people for in other areas. Like it's kind of shoddy interpretation of the research. You don't have the background or the expertise to interpret this data very well, but it aligns with your bias, so you're sharing it. And I think that's a huge, gap or hole in the evidence-based space in general, is they're very selective about like what evidence they care about and where they want to be very meticulous and where they're really lazy and sloppy. With that recent, squats or cardio study, there's so many issues with that, just even down to the methodology of using a gas exchange test that measures, respiration during an activity that's fairly short in duration and involves breath holding, where you might not actually be breathing at all for bits of time, and then all of a sudden you're breathing a lot and then not breathing. You're going to see spikes in oxygen intake and CO2 exchange that aren't necessarily reflective of average whole body oxygen utilization. But people that are interpreting this that don't have an expertise in doing these assessments, I've performed hundreds of gas exchange tests myself on people on treadmills, bikes, rowers. I've tested people doing kettlebell complexes with a mask on. I've performed these tests. If you don't have the expertise to know what are the limitations inherent to the testing equipment, et cetera, you're prone to make some kind of lazy interpretations of the research. And I just find it interesting that a lot of people in this evidence-based space that are very, very meticulous in some areas take, a cardio study and draw very strong conclusions without really knowing what they're talking about.
What do you think the net negative, and I don't want to lead you too much with the question, but what do you think the impact on just the average person that's like scrolling through Instagram, trying to figure out like, what am I going to do in 2025 to like just look a little bit better, feel a little bit better? Like, what impact do you think a lot of the messaging of, hey, this study suggests that like this is optimal, or this is the best warm up, or a lot of the stuff that you see, and how can people kind of like navigate through like what's noise and what's like worth picking up and taking to the gym with you?
Yeah. I think that most people they're not going to be exercise experts. They're probably not going to be fitness fanatics, and that's okay. Like, the general population is just trying to be healthy, be fit, be fairly strong without trying to make fitness their whole life. And I think the vast majority of content is sort of a distraction from the fundamentals that work really well. Jason was talking about the importance of effort and how good CrossFit has been for that. I couldn't agree with that more. A lot of CrossFit workouts, for example, or Metcons, you could pick them apart on paper and be like, this is why that Metcon is stupid. It doesn't make sense the way you're going from this exercise to this exercise. Maybe it's not ideal, but if it gets people working their fucking ass off for 10 minutes all out, there's so much benefit to that. And I think that most people scrolling Instagram, they don't understand the fundamentals of just getting an appropriate amount of strength training volume for each muscle group, 1 to 3 times a week. They don't understand the importance of just getting a certain amount of total aerobic activity of any kind. They don't understand the importance of getting a little bit of high intensity aerobic training. They're just the fundamental categories. They don't understand that, and they start trying to optimize and worry about details like this is the best 20-minute warm-up routine, and then they do a 20-minute warm-up routine, and then they're like, I don't have time for cardio. It's like, well, no shit, you don't have time for cardio because you spent all your time making these subtle optimizations that's distracting you from the bigger picture. And so that's the consequence that I think we have. If you're someone who trains full-time or you're super into it and you're going to the gym a couple hours a day, you can afford some of these distractions, but most people just can't. Like, I know people who they're lucky if they get to the gym once in a week. And if they're only going to the gym once in a week, I want them busting their ass on the fundamentals. Like, go lift some heavy shit for every muscle group, do some cardio, get your heart rate up. Like, that's what we need to be doing. But instead you're like going through some, foam rolling 7-step activation, like nervous system potentiation warm-up bullshit, and not doing the things that you actually need to be doing. That's what drives me nuts.
Do you think people just are uncomfortable with getting uncomfortable? Like, is that a part of it? Or is it just like they legitimately believe that either they're going to get injured or not get enough of their training if they don't, activate their glutes and all that good stuff?
That's a tough question. I think there's definitely some of both. But the more that I've talked to people, I find that people are more willing than I might have expected to work hard if they know that it's going to be getting them the result that they want. I think if there's a clear connection between, if I put forth this effort, I'm going to achieve X, I think people are not as lazy as we think they are. I think that they're overwhelmed. I think that they're busy as shit. They are overwhelmed with just all of this information. And yeah, there's some fear mongering involved too. But I think once you address some of those things and you put people at ease and you're like, no, if you do this, you're going to get the result. I think people are generally willing to work. I think you just have to give them an environment where that's possible. And that, again, I love CrossFit for that. The community aspect, a sense of camaraderie. I think just putting people in a space where they feel good about working hard and pushing themselves is huge.
I wanted to kind of, I guess, switch gears for just a quick second. I wanted to ask about your athletic background, sport. And so you got into the hybrid, you got into obstacle racing, you got into non-traditional sports, right? And I know that as a kid, you were playing traditional sports, like your baseball, your football, your basketball. For a parent of someone who's in the CrossFit space, right? Say someone listening who, there's like the CrossFit Kids, there's all different types like CrossFit competitions for kids. I guess my question would be, like, looking back on it, how much did you play a role in like pursuing sports that benefited your height and weight versus pursuing sports that you enjoyed? And what recommendations would you give to parents on guiding their children if they have an interest in non-traditional sports versus traditional sports? Because you took the non-traditional sport route. I was racing BMX bikes, I was non-traditional, but when I got into high school, I went traditional. So I guess, what type of insight did your parents provide there? And what factors did you take into consideration knowing that you could be good at this and you chose this path versus another path? I'm just, kind of like takeaway for parents there.
So for me personally, I kind of had the odds stacked against me a little bit. I went to school, I was a couple years younger than a lot of my peers. I started school earlier. I was 2 years younger than everyone else in my grade. I went to school early for academics. So when I was trying to play football, for example, like, I'm competing against kids who are years ahead of me in terms of, athletic development and puberty and all that kind of stuff. So I just wasn't going to be as good as some of them. I was always shorter, smaller, lighter. I just didn't let that stop me. I just kind of did a little bit of everything just because I wanted to do it, not because I thought it would suit my height or weight or anything like that, because that was never going to be an advantage for me. But in terms of recommendations, I think it's important to realize that for most sports, with a few exceptions, for most sports, one of the key differentiating factors between world-class athletes and just national class athletes. So what's the difference between making it to the elite level versus, stopping a little bit short? One of the key differentiating factors is that world-class athletes on average started later and played a wider variety of sports when they were growing up. And so to any parent who's thinking they need to rush their kid into, oh, this is the sport you're going to be really good at, there's not a whole lot of benefit into trying to get your kids into their final sport extra early. Like, let them play, let them have a wide range of experiences, because on average that's only going to benefit their athleticism and their potential and their peak in their sport later in life. So don't be worried about that, because it's probably doing them a disservice. We want, first and foremost, to foster a healthy relationship with sports and a healthy relationship with exercise and movement. And if you're trying to tell someone like, hey, you should do this sport because this is what you're going to be good at or whatever, I think that's counter to, developing the healthy relationship with movement that we really want. So let it be fun. Focus on having kids do a wide range of things that they personally find enjoyment and fulfillment in, and they can find their way to, their ideal sport later on. And they'll be doing that from a place of strength and really good, GPP, general physical preparedness, that they've developed from that, wide range of sports. So my advice to a parent is try to step back and let your kids be kids, let them play. Don't be trying to turn them into pro athletes from a young age.
Man, we've talked about youth sports quite a bit on the podcast. I know Jason's neck deep in the youth sport culture and world right now. And it's everything you're saying. And Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, is like opposite to kind of what the culture is. Like, I know I have conversations
for sure.
here. My kids are super young, but I'll have conversations here in Texas with parents, and they're like talking about how, if you don't get them into the right travel baseball league now, they're going to quote unquote fall behind. So I wonder how, I don't know, Jay, how much truth is there to that?
Well, I think what Alec is referring to, I do believe, and maybe we could pull this up later, or Liz can pull it up. Like, I do believe there's like strong statistics that back up what he's referring to. I just think it's easier said than done, right? Because as a parent, you start narrowing down and you get pulled in, man. It's like, and I could see how people get pulled in, because you get pulled in by the coaches, you get pulled in by the league, you get pulled in by the kids, because all those things are gravitating towards this sport. And I think that there is a misconception that like parents are like feeding their kids into these sports. I think there's some of them. Some of them, dude, like the kid just wants to only do that. And you have to actively as a parent be like, dude, no, I think we need to back off that a little bit and let's go explore these other things. And it's hard because I'm living that right now. Like, my son wants to play baseball 24/7, 365. And I have to be like, hey man, let's go do this. Let's go do that. Because I don't want him, to your point, Alec, first off, I want him to develop athleticism across a variety of things. I don't want him to get burnt out. I don't want him to be the kid that, burns out as an 8th grader instead of reaching his potential as a high school or college athlete. So yeah, man, it's a real thing.
I think a great thing for someone like your son is if he's plugged into like a good strength and conditioning program to provide a little bit more of that well-rounded stimulus. I think that's great versus just showing up at baseball practice every day and that kind of thing. I think that's a huge, benefit in the area that strength and conditioning programs can really shine, because especially at a young age, like, strength and conditioning isn't and probably shouldn't vary a ton from one sport to the next. Like, the fundamentals are the fundamentals. There's a few differences, right? But having that base of just fitness to progress with some strength training and that kind of thing is great. And I think that'll save you from a lot of the troubles that, early sports specialization can bring if you have that well-rounded, fitness program in the background.
Yeah. Have you worked with a variety of kids, or do you mainly work with adults?
I mostly work with adults. I've had a handful of kids, but it's not my main thing.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the way that I'm approaching it, at least the kids, is like trying to keep it fun, et cetera, et cetera. But then just using like fundamental strength conditioning. Like, I don't really have them doing like CrossFit type stuff. Like, we're not doing handstand push-ups and muscle-ups. We're not trying to learn those skills, because we're accumulating skills outside the gym and we're utilizing the gym to develop our strength conditioning. It's kind of like the way I look at it. If they decide later on in life they want to accumulate skills in the gym, that's their decision. But there's so many other skills to learn in sport that we're kind of focused on the strength conditioning side.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on Bob really quick. I watched
Hell yeah, Bob. Let's go, Bob.
Man, Bob got me fired up this morning when I was watching that YouTube podcast. So for anyone listening, they have to go and check out Alec's YouTube podcast with his grandfather, Bob. But tell me a little bit about, man, just what a cool story of the late start. And the takeaway here, and what I want you to talk about a little bit is hopefully people listening, because I know that for a lot of people, they're fed this like BS story of like, hey, you haven't been doing stuff for X amount of times, whether you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s, and it's too late to start, or, like and maybe this even plays into the other thing I want to talk about, which is the anti-fragile kind of idea. But there's this also belief that like you're going to get injured at a certainty. Like there comes a time where like that stuff isn't for you, like really got to keep it to like water aerobics or whatever. But man, I mean, the proof's in the pudding with your granddad. So talk to me a little bit about Bob and anti-fragility and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So first, the story with Bob. So when I started doing some of the Spartan races, the obstacle course races, I was pretty young. I brought it up to my parents. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna go do this Spartan thing. And my dad is just the kind of guy. He's like, well, if my son can do it, I can do it. Like he wants to beat me at everything. Like he wants to arm wrestle, like whatever. He would never let me win as a kid, right? So I'm going to do this thing. He's like, well, if you're doing it, I'm doing it. And he called his dad, so my grandfather Bob. And it's like, hey, I'm doing this obstacle race with Alec. I think you should do it. And he's 67. He's not an athlete. He's not a runner. And somehow, I don't know if he guilts him into it or what, but somehow my dad convinces my grandpa that he should do a Spartan race at 67, untrained. So he shows up. He's 67. He does the race. At one point during the race, he's trying to climb up the rope. He falls off the rope climb and breaks his ribs. Which, I mean, that's kind of what you would expect from a 67-year-old dude going out and doing a Spartan race untrained, But instead of saying like, this isn't for me, which I think most people would say, he was like, I need to get better. Like this can't happen again, is what he said. So he healed his ribs. He went home. He started going to the gym 4 days a week. He starts running. He's like, he was basically embarrassed that had happened, that he showed up, he got injured, he couldn't do the thing that he wanted to do with his family. So he started taking fitness really seriously and just went all in at age 67. Now it's been 13 years. He's run ultra marathons. He's done like 30 Spartan races. He does like 10 local 5Ks and 10Ks per year still at age 80. Last year, he was doing some housework. He fell off a ladder, tore his hamstring and glute med, and it pulled some of his hip off with it. So he fractured his hip, ruptured his hamstring at 79. He had surgery, did full rehab. He's back out there. He's running again. I just ran 4 miles with him. I was home for Christmas, got to run 4 miles with him and do a little interview for my YouTube channel. And he's a hell of an inspiration to still be out there doing that. And talking with him, whether it's the smartest idea or not, what really shines through is just he won't be stopped. So like the broken ribs didn't stop him, hamstring rupture didn't stop him. He had heart surgery and went running the next day, which is a terrible idea, but like he's just that screw loose that he's not going to stop. And it's like you have to have a little bit of that mindset, maybe not to that extreme, but you have to have a little bit of that mindset to have that sort of longevity and to be able to do some of these cool things. And that's part of what inspires me to have, I have it on my sweatshirt here, the Anti-Fragile Lifting Club, because as a personal trainer who works in a gym, I'm constantly getting clients who they think that they're too old. They're worried about, they're pathologically worried about injury to the point that they don't put forth any effort. And I just see a lot of the like fear mongering messages that sometimes people are bombarded with online. And I see the consequences of that in terms of people are sacrificing and missing out on so much. They're missing out on the benefits of fitness because they're worried that, oh, my knee hurts a little bit, I'm too old for this now, which to me is just totally backwards. Like that's all the more reason to be as fit as you possibly can. And I think my grandfather is a fantastic example of that, because He used to be a 3-pack a day smoker. He's had injuries, he's had surgeries, he's had heart operations, and he hasn't let it stop him. He's still out there doing it. And people will see someone at 80 years old that is out there running, and they're like, I want to do that. I want to be like that. They're like, but I have bad knees or whatever. It's like, well, so does he. And he's out there doing it anyway. Like, that shouldn't be the thing that stops you. It should be the thing that motivates you even more.
Yeah, Bob's a great story. I mean, it brings up a point though that we get a lot, which is pushing and pulling with your family. I think it's just such a fine line. I'm curious how that's been for you, because you don't have any children, right? You don't
No.
know. Once you have children, I mean, with the children is one thing, but with your mom and dad, it's another, and it's tough. My parents have definitely gone in evolution. At times, they were really, really active in our gym. At times, not as active. It's kind of ebbed and flowed. And man, you could have some really contentious conversations if you push the wrong way. And
Yes.
I think it's such a blessing if your dad and your grandpa can go do something like that. I mean, I can't even speak to how awesome that is to have 3 generations running together as an example, right? But I'm wondering how you get there, like what type of conversations can occur, or if it's just like these type of people are drawn to this and you just got lucky, because like, how has that been with your family and those type of conversations? Because you got Bob, right? Bob's crushing it, but how about your grandma? How about your mother? Like,
Right.
and how have those conversations gone? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm lucky that I have a lot of active, healthy people in my family, but I have a lot of unhealthy and sedentary people in my family too. And I think, the best thing that you can do is just be a great example, and just be there for them to, maybe offer a little bit of guidance. If they ask questions, be kind, be considerate. I don't think we should ever feel like we need to, shove messages down people's throat or anything like that. I think that's a turn off when you come at people too hard like that. But I think just being the example and focusing on yourself first and foremost, is going to be great. So then people will start asking you like, "Hey, I aspire to be like that," as opposed to you telling them what they need to do. They say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I don't think that you can look at an unhealthy family member and say, "Hey, we gotta do something about this." I think that's hard to do. But I think that deep down, a lot of people want to be healthier. They want to be fitter. They just have a reason why they think they can't. I heard another coach, I can't remember his name, or I'll give him credit for this analogy. But I heard a coach give kind of this short story of, if you sit down in a room full of people and say, there's buried treasure, somewhere in the state, there's $1 million in it. No one's going to move. No one's going to get up and go running looking for that treasure. But if you say, hey, there's $1 million of buried treasure somewhere in this room, people are going to get up and start moving, right? And it's because you've made the goal more accessible. And so I think for a lot of people who are sedentary and they aren't active, it's not that they don't want it. It's just that suitcase is somewhere out there. It's not in the room with us right now. If you can get that suitcase of money in the room, people are going to get up and move. So I think what you have to do is have conversations with people that make them realize that they can do it. Not telling them like you should do it. They know they should do it. They have to feel like they can do it. So making things accessible, making things easy. I don't think that people are categorically lazy, or I don't think that one of my sedentary family members is categorically more lazy than I am. They just feel like that first step is a little bit too far. And I was lucky enough that I was able to start taking small steps, from a young age. But the further and further you go, the more you kind of drift from that goal. And it just seems so much more insurmountable, where when you highlight, hey, this is what you can accomplish in 15 minutes a week, I think that's way more motivating to people than saying like, hey, you got to lose 100 pounds. I think it just seems so big that it's demotivating. And again, it's like that suitcase out there a million miles away. But when you say, hey, this is what we could accomplish in 15 minutes a week, how does that sound to you? I think that's a way better approach. So I know it was a little bit of a rambling answer, but I think we can't push too hard, but when we do, we have to be gentle, and we have to focus on small steps and making it as easy for people as possible. Because they're not lazy; they're just normal, like you and I. We were just a little bit luckier to get an earlier start.
And I think that the tough thing too, because I agree, right? Like you have to be the example. But I think the tough thing becomes that like by you being the example, sometimes that can like reinforce the fact that like the first step seems so daunting because people will always be like, well, Alec is, doing 275 for 30 at 160 body weight or breaking the Murph record. But that's not what fitness has to be for most people. It's not, even if they want it to be, it's not, right? Like for a
Yeah.
lot of people, the benefits are in maybe getting some more steps. And like you said, once a week, getting in the gym and doing like one full body session will get you, in front of 80% of 90% of people out there, just because literally you're giving one day to the gym. On that note, I'm curious. We have a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot, but a decent amount of people that email in because we offer training programs and both of our main training programs are 5 training days a week. They can be done, I would say, within like 60 minutes tops, maybe a little bit more if you're not like really on top of it. But for someone that says 3 days, that's all I got, 3 days and like has to be less than 40 minutes, like ideally 30 minutes. What are you giving someone for like general being a capable human being, improving their body composition a little bit, like hitting all the bases? They got 3 days and 30 to 40 minutes.
Great. So there's a number of ways you could divide the work across the week, but I generally want to see someone training each muscle group at least twice a week. If I have 3 days to work with, I'll either do 2 full body sessions and a session that's more cardio focused, or I'll divide that across all 3 sessions. So all 3 sessions are full body with a little bit of cardio. I generally, especially if it's only 3 days a week and very limited time, I'm going to spend the vast majority of that on strength training and then a small portion of that on high intensity cardio, getting as much bang for the buck as we can with just a couple hard intervals. So, for example, on a full body session, I might just run through a squat, hinge, push, and pull, 1 to 2 working sets each for those movement patterns, and then get someone into 5-minute cardio warm up. Give me 4 60-second all out efforts with generous recovery. I think you can knock out a session like that in well under an hour and get a ton of benefit from that. If you repeat variations of that a couple days a week, so the second day, maybe we pick slightly different movements for your push and pull. Maybe instead of a bench press in a row, we're going to overhead press and a pull down. For the cardio, instead of 60-second intervals, I just want you to give me like one long 10-minute moderate effort piece. I think you can get a ton of benefit from that without spending more than 30 minutes in the strength and 10 to 15 minutes in the cardio. 3 days a week of that, if the effort is there, if you know how to do a couple warm-up feeder sets, you know how to push close to failure. I think if you just do one working set very, very hard, good range of motion, good effort on a squat, hinge, push, pull, tremendous results from that. We can always add on, but that's a fantastic start. And I think that alone is going to get someone at least halfway there, if not 60, 70%.
I love that. It's literally that simple. Alec, I know we're coming up on time, but I did have one other thing that I was super curious about, man, because I think a lot of people associate being plant-based vegan with
we forgot to talk about the vegan.
Not being, not strength athletes. I think that more people would associate it with like endurance athletes, but not strength, not hypertrophy, not putting on muscle. How long have you been plant-based? And I guess in your experience, like how can you speak to the fact that there definitely is a way to, eat plant-based and accomplish all of the things that you've accomplished, which is get super strong, put 30 pounds of muscle since the first time you ran a 249 marathon in the second, and all the things that you continue to do and avoid injury.
Yeah, so I've been plant-based for 16 years. I kind of started that around the same time I started getting really into fitness, because some of my earliest fitness inspirations were also plant-based. So I just kind of started following in their footsteps and never looked back because it's been working really well for me. But I think more than anything, it's just a reminder that it's not about preaching a specific diet or pushing a specific diet, like, vegan, carnivore, whatever it is. I just want to remind people like there's options and there's power in the fundamentals. If you're hitting your recommended protein intake, you're eating an appropriate amount of calories for you, you're getting some vitamins and minerals, fruits, veggies, whatever, you can accomplish a ton on the fundamentals. And I think people focus too much on specific diets, specific methods, specific techniques, whatever, and they don't focus enough on, first principles like, protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber. Like there's so many ways to do that. And for me, being plant-based is less about thinking it's an ideal way to diet, or it's, the healthiest way to live. And it's more about just aligning with my worldview and ethics and that kind of thing. But my biggest thing that I want to remind people is don't fall into thinking you need to be this or that or whatever. Focus on the big picture principles, and there's a million ways to do it.
Yeah,
Dude.
I love that take, man. Just because man, talk about dogmatic. People get dogmatic about nutrition stuff and
Alec,
diet.
what builds up your protein for your diet? Being vegan for 16 years, I imagine you've gone in ebbs and flows.
It's definitely varied a little bit. I will say, like, it's going to be different for me than for a lot of people because of my cardio training volume. My calorie needs are just so much higher than most people my size, and with my protein needs. So, like, for me, my body weight, my activity level, I try to get about 150 grams of protein, but I'm generally working with like 3,500 to 4,000 calories. And getting 150 grams of protein from 4,000 calories is a piece of cake. Totally different if you're trying to hit 150 grams of protein on 2,000 calories. Totally different conversation. Your protein sources and all that are going to need to be much more dialed in. For me, if I just eat enough food, I'm generally going to be pretty damn close. If I have a healthy portion of tofu, beans, if I have a protein bar serving a protein powder, I'm for sure going to hit it. If I was less active, if I was doing less cardio, I'd need to be a little bit more specific and intentional about it. But to be honest, I don't have to think about it that much personally.
Yeah, I think that's definitely where there's some truth where, again, like, the ethics of it aside, it can be a little bit tougher for people that aren't as active as you, because if you want to hit that protein goal, you are going to have to get more creative. Not that it's impossible, but more creative with plant-based sources. But it's definitely doable. And I love that you mentioned protein as kind of one of the fundamentals. We just put out what I think is a really useful training protocol for people that follow our training programs. And like the first one is just protein is king. Like if you're going to focus on counting and tracking anything, like make sure you're hitting that number, and you're half of the way there. Honestly, I think that there's so much debate and nuance about like high carb, high fat, as long as you're getting the calories to support or, put you in a deficit if you're trying to lose weight and you're hitting the protein goal, you're like literally 70% of the way there.
Dude, for sure. When I work with people on nutrition, the first thing I tell them is like, I just want you to take a look at protein, hit protein targets for a couple of weeks and get back to me. We're going to see how you feel. We're going to see how things are looking. We'll change things from there, but let's do that first before we touch anything else.
Love it, man.
Dude.
Love it.
That and getting rid of alcohol. Well, that's what I've been.
Yeah.
Gabe, we're doing that's part of it, is that we're getting rid of alcohol, and it's been. I mean, we're only a few days in the new year, so it's been good for me. But dude, I appreciate it, Alec. Like, I mean, it's been. One last thing, if you had to summarize, I know you got into online training before you got into in-person training. And I think one of the things that we're trying to be better about on this show, at least for me, I don't want to speak for Gabe, I do think it's important. We have so many conversations with so many people, and you are a beacon of like what your perspective is and what you've learned in your life, right? And everybody comes from different experiences. I came up in the gym business, and I started owning a gym at 21. And so I came up doing individual and group classes, but in person, not online. Now we do online, but we started off in person. I'm curious, like, what at a high level, what was the biggest shift from being on a computer from someone to actually being in person? Like, oh shit, my perspective was not reality.
Oh, that's a great question. A huge portion of it is just the demographic I work with online and in person is also very, very different. But I come from a pretty privileged background. Fitness has always been a part of my life, and I've always generally had the time and money and opportunity to pursue healthy habits without a lot of restrictions, which has made it very easy for me. And I think starting coaching online, I was just a little bit disconnected from some of the realities that people face coming from different circumstances, and getting to work with people in person. You realize everyone's got their shit. Like, no matter what background they come from, or how much money they have or what they do for work. Like you start working with people in person and realize some of the shit they got going on in their life, you can absolutely see why people don't prioritize their health and fitness. So it just reminded me, or it showed me how important it is to be more, I don't know if accommodating is the right word, more understanding of the struggles that people face. And then not everyone can just like, you tell people like, oh, you all got the same 24 hours a day and that bullshit. It just doesn't work in practice. You know what I mean? People got a lot of stuff going on. So I think we have to account for that in how we program for them, how we communicate with them, work with their pre-existing, beliefs, misconceptions, fears, whatever it is. We have to work with all of those sorts of things when we communicate with them, and we have to be understanding of, variable stress and fatigue and lifestyle factors in terms of how they influence recovery and training readiness and that kind of stuff. Most people's, Whoop score is not going to be driven primarily by their training stress. It's going to be driven by everything else. And so being able to, navigate that in the context of how we program for people, I think is really important. And that's something that's hard to get from just being online. But at least working with people in person, then it teaches you like what questions to ask, what conversations to have. So I think that's super helpful.
That's a really good answer. I wasn't expecting it to be that way, but that's a really good answer. Thank you. Well, dude, I appreciate you, Alec, for being on the show. I appreciate everybody who's checking out the episode. Make sure to go back, check out all the other incredible guests we've had on the show. We also obviously have episodes with me, Gabe, MDV, and Dennis, and of course the ones with Gabe and I. I hope you guys are training hard in the new year, getting after it, and have an awesome 2025.